My name is Travis Montoya. I'm 37 years old, and for the better part of the last decade, I've made my living as a travel photographer. It's not as glamorous as it sounds. Most of my assignments are small magazines or online outlets, and I haven't had a big break in years. Still, it's a job that lets me wander, camera in hand, chasing the kind of beauty and mystery you don't often see in your own backyard. That's what brought me to Ohio's Hocking Hills State Park last October. I'd heard rumors of a place, off the beaten track, called Witches Hollow, a spot most travelers avoided, but one that promised dramatic scenery and a legendary bit of history lurking in its shadows. Figuring it would yield some atmospheric autumn shots and maybe a fresh spark to my portfolio, I loaded up my RV and drove straight into those rugged hills. I arrived late in the day, after winding along two-lane roads that snaked past farmland and thick patches of forest. The main section of Hocking Hills was crowded with families, college kids, and day hikers with trekking poles. My goal wasn't to stay near the well-worn paths to Old Man's Cave or Ash Cave. I'd done my research, rummaging through a few local blogs that mentioned a lesser-known spur leading to Witches Hollow. The name alone intrigued me. Legend had it that a woman accused of witchcraft was hanged in that area back in the 1800s, and she cursed the land with her dying breath. Most people dismissed the story as myth, but the swirling rumors made me suspect it was the perfect place to capture haunting, moody images. At the time, I figured it might just be folklore. I never expected to find anything genuinely unearthly. I stopped by the small ranger station to register. A no-nonsense woman named Carla Hicks sat behind the counter. She was somewhere in her 40s with sun-weathered skin and a ball cap pulled low. When I told her I wanted to camp near Witches Hollow, her eyebrows rose above the brim of her cap. "Not many people choose that area," she said, tapping her pen against a sign-in form. "We've had vandalism reports over the last couple of weeks, strange stuff. I'd recommend the established campground if you're looking for a scenic spot." I smiled, sliding the form back to her. "No offense, but I'm after something a little more atmospheric. I do photography, and I heard the Hollow has some unique rock formations." Carla studied me for a moment. "Yeah, the geology's interesting out there," she conceded. "But be careful. Stay mindful of your surroundings, and if anything feels off, come back to the main camp, understand?" She didn't elaborate, and I was too eager to get out, into the woods, to press for details. I thanked her, hopped back in my RV, and continued down a narrow, cracked asphalt road that soon turned to gravel. Dense trees loomed on either side. After a couple of miles, the gravel gave way to a dirt track. Leaves whipped up behind my tires, a swirl of red and gold. The air smelled like damp earth and the beginnings of autumn decay. Eventually, I found the clearing I'd read about online. Mossy boulders formed a natural barrier on one side, and a cluster of maples created a semi-open space perfect for parking. I shut off the engine and climbed out, camera around my neck just to drink in the crisp air. In the distance, I heard a waterfall, or maybe just a creek spilling over rocks. The hush of the forest held a promise of solitude. Perfect. I spent that first afternoon scouting the area for photo angles. The hollow's namesake was a deep indentation in the ground, rimmed with old oaks that twisted skyward, according to the local blogs. If you followed the small stream that carved through the forest, you'd find a hidden waterfall feeding into a cave-like overhang. I wanted to see it for myself, so I set off with my gear. The trail leading down into the hollow wasn't officially marked. I relied on a photocopied map from a local historian named Alex Lex Murphy, someone I'd called a few days prior for tips. He was known for collecting legends and bits of lore. Following his rough directions, I pushed aside thick undergrowth until I reached the lip of a steep ravine. Down below, tree roots curled around rocks, and sunlight filtered through in dusty beams. The path was slippery with fallen leaves, but I managed to pick my way down. When I reached the bottom, I paused to take a few test shots. The place had a surreal quality, like a twilight world out of time, where everything felt older than it should be. A faint breeze carried the scent of wet stone. I heard trickling water up ahead and moved toward the sound. Sure enough, a modest waterfall spilled over a rocky ledge into a shallow pool. I snapped a few shots, adjusting for the dimness under the canopy. The photos on my camera's preview screen looked good. Haunting, moody, exactly what I wanted. But as I framed a wide shot of the waterfall, I noticed something odd in the far corner of my viewfinder, a shape that didn't belong. It was just at the edge, like a silhouette half hiding behind a boulder. I blinked and shifted my camera, but there was nothing there. When I checked the photos I'd just taken, I could make out a dark blur. Possibly a person, maybe just a trick of the light. The hairs on my arms prickled. I was alone, wasn't I? I stood still for a moment, scanning the rocks. No movement, no sign of another hiker. It was probably my imagination. Still, I felt unsettled enough that I decided to head back to my RV before dusk. On my way, I passed a thick-trunked oak with weird markings carved into it. The symbols looked almost like twisted letters or runes, not the usual hearts and initials graffiti you see in parks. I snapped a photo, intending to ask Lex about it later. Back at the clearing, I set up a little camp stove to cook dinner. My RV had basic comforts: bed, small kitchen, bathroom, but I liked the fresh air. By the time darkness settled over the forest, I was content in the hush. Occasional night insects chirped, but the typical hoots and rustles of wildlife seemed subdued, as though the forest was quieter than normal. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to my own nerves. The shapes in my pictures, the odd carvings, it was all part of the atmosphere I'd come looking for, right? Night wore on. I retired to the RV around 10, sorting through the day's shots on my laptop. Most looked good except for 2 or 3 frames that had bizarre smudges or distortions near the edges. In one shot, it almost resembled a woman's face, half formed in shadow. I cursed under my breath, assuming it was a camera glitch or a reflection. I tried a bit of editing to remove the blotches, but they were stubborn. The more I zoomed in, the more they seemed to form patterns, like swirling shapes within the smudge. A wave of unease swept over me. I decided I was just tired. Sometime after midnight, I woke to a faint tapping on the RV side. My eyes shot open, adrenaline surging. I waited, breath held, ears straining. There it was again, a light, rhythmic tap, tap, tap. Quickly, I grabbed a flashlight, slid from my bed, and inched to the window. The outside floodlight on my RV was off, so I switched it on. Harsh white illumination bathed the clearing. Nothing moved. I stood there, heart hammering, for what felt like an eternity. Then a shuffle of footfalls sounded near the tree line. I jerked my flashlight beam in that direction, catching a glimpse of a hunched figure wearing what appeared to be a long shawl. The figure looked up, and for a moment I thought it was an elderly woman. I couldn't see her face well, but I saw one bony hand clutching the shawl at her collar. Our eyes met across the clearing, and I felt an inexplicable jolt of dread. Then, in one smooth motion, she turned and disappeared into the darkness. I dashed outside, but the forest had already swallowed her. Sleep came in fitful snatches the rest of that night. In the morning, I told myself I must have run into a lost camper or local wanderer. Why anyone would wander around an unmarked campsite after midnight was beyond me, but rationalizing it helped me focus on my photography again. Besides, I'd come looking for something unusual, hadn't I? Before heading back into the hollow, I decided to stop in town and visit Lex Murphy. He'd mentioned he ran a small shop selling postcards and local history books. If anyone knew about weird runes and creepy visitors in shawls, it would be him. The drive to town took nearly an hour on those winding roads. Lex's place was easy to spot, an old wooden storefront with Murphy's Mercantile and Local Lore painted in faded letters across the top. Inside, the smell of old paper and dust greeted me. Shelves were crammed with antiques, used books, and cheap tourist trinkets. Lex stood behind the counter, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a stubbly chin. He greeted me warmly, remembering I'd called about Witch's Hollow. When I told him about the markings on the tree, he asked me to show him the photo on my camera. He leaned in, squinting. "Looks like some variant of old runic script," he said. "Could be a mishmash of things. A lot of kids come out here thinking they're witches carving nonsense, but that style, He flipped open a dusty reference book on his counter. "I've seen something like it in accounts of 19th century curses. You know, back when they hanged a supposed witch named Agatha Fields. Legend says she cursed the men who killed her. Livestock died, crops failed, all that. Some claim her spirit is tethered to the hollow. I raised an eyebrow. So it's not just a ghost story? You think these carvings are legit? Lex shrugged. Could be. There was definitely a woman named Agatha Fields. Town records show she was tried for witchcraft. This was well before the area was even called Hocking Hills. A few diaries mention her publicly declaring a curse. Hard to say if any of it stuck. But folks still talk about hearing chanting in the woods or seeing a figure in old-fashioned clothing. My stomach tightened. I thought about the night visitor in the shawl. I also saw an older woman near my campsite last night. She was unsettling. Didn't say a word, just tapped on my RV and left. Lex folded his arms. You're not the first to mention that, you know. Some hikers talk about glimpsing an old woman at dusk, but whenever they follow, she's gone. Usually. Near that hollow, too. The conversation left me with a swirl of unease and excitement. I thanked Lex, buying a small used book of local legends and a couple of old postcards showing the Hocking Hills of a century ago. Then I headed back to the ranger station to see if Carla Hicks had any insights. She listened to my story with a furrowed brow. I've heard about the so-called Witch's Hollow for years, she admitted. Hanging stories, curses, missing hikers. I chalk most of it up to the environment. These woods can be disorienting, especially at night. But if you truly feel unsafe, you should stay in the main campground. Don't let superstition push you into danger. I assured her I'd be careful. Driving back to my campsite, I tried to maintain my skeptical approach, but a part of me felt a magnetic pull. The idea of capturing photographic evidence of something unexplainable, even if it was just a swirl of mist or an eerie silhouette, was too compelling to pass up. This could be the break I needed, the shot that puts me on the map in the photography world, or so I told myself. Late that afternoon, I set up a rudimentary motion sensor and a tripod with a remote trigger near the tree line. If anyone, or anything, came close, the camera's flash would go off, hopefully snapping a clear picture. I also placed a small Polaroid camera on the steps of my RV, angled to catch movement in the clearing. Night fell, bringing a chilled wind through the trees. Leaves skittered across the ground. I made a quick meal of noodles on my camp stove, then retreated to the RV. I kept my lights off except for a dim lantern, hoping to encourage my visitor to return. Hours passed, thick with tension. I jumped at every noise, a distant owl, a branch snapping, the rustle of squirrels in the leaves. My eyes felt heavy, but I forced myself to stay awake. Around 1 a.m, the motion sensor beeped. My heart nearly stopped. I grabbed my flashlight and pressed against the window, peering out. For a split second, the flash on my tripod camera went off, illuminating the clearing. In that burst of light, I saw a hunched figure again. It wore a dark shawl or cloak, face hidden in shadow. The bright strobe revealed a gaunt outline, almost skeletal. Then the darkness swallowed it up. Adrenaline shot through me. I tumbled out of the RV, Polaroid in hand, snapping blindly. The flash popped, capturing random slices of the clearing. In the afterglow, I glimpsed the figure at the edge of the forest. It lifted an arm, pointing a withered finger. My breath caught in my throat. The Polaroid camera whirred, ejecting a developing photo that fluttered at my feet. When I shone my flashlight again, the figure was gone. My hands shook as I waited for the Polaroid to develop. The image was distorted, but I could make out something resembling a human face in the corner. The lines were off, like it was elongated or turned sideways. My mind screamed that it was impossible for a person's face to be shaped that way. Some deep fear within me insisted I wasn't looking at a normal human at all. Dawn came slowly, bringing gray light through the canopy. Exhausted, I ventured outside to check my tripod camera. My breath caught as I saw runes similar to the ones carved on the oak now scratched into the side of my RV. The paint was gouged, deep and deliberate. I ran my hand over the grooves, anger and dread sparking in my chest. Another Polaroid lay, on the ground near the tripod, ejected from the camera's remote trigger. In it, the figure stood closer than I'd realized, half silhouetted by the flash. I could swear I saw the suggestion of a face, eyes like dark pits, a slash for a mouth. I shivered so hard I had to bite my lip. I decided that morning to push deeper into the legend. I recalled Lex mentioning a cave system near Old Man's Cave that some believed connected to Witch's Hollow. Maybe if I explored there, I'd find answers. Proof of pranks or an old caretaker living off the grid. I was in over my head, but the thought of letting this go felt impossible. I couldn't stand the idea of leaving with half-formed evidence. Securing my gear. I drove to a small parking area near one of the lesser-known trails that linked up to Old Man's Cave. The route wound through towering cliffs and narrow gorges, the stone walls damp with moss. The deeper I descended, the cooler the air became. Water dripped somewhere in the distance. I moved quietly, feeling an odd pressure in my ears like the hush that precedes a thunderstorm. After nearly an hour of scrambling through rocky passages, I spotted an opening in the rock face, half hidden by ferns. A faint draft of air wafted, out smelling of damp earth. My headlamp revealed a twisting corridor beyond, the walls narrowing. My intuition screamed that going inside alone might be a terrible decision, but a pull stronger than fear drove me forward. The passage opened into a small cavern, the floor uneven with jutting stones. I heard a faint sound, like whispered chanting. It rose and fell, too soft to decipher. My skin prickled. I switched off my headlamp for a moment, letting my eyes adjust. A sickly glow flickered from a tunnel on the far side, as if firelight was dancing on the walls. Step by cautious step, I made my way toward it. Inside the next chamber, the rock ceiling soared overhead. Stalactites dripped mineral-laden water onto the floor. In the center, a half-circle of stones formed what looked like an ancient fire ring. The ashes were cold, but faint footprints smeared the dirt around it. My pulse hammered. I lifted my camera to snap photos, but the battery icon blinked red, even though I'd fully charged it that morning. With a low curse, I took a couple of shots anyway, ignoring the flickering screen. The chanting grew louder. I swung my camera's viewfinder around, but there was no one in the chamber. Yet the sound persisted, echoing as if the stones themselves recited the words. My heart threatened to burst from my chest. Could I be hearing a remnant of something that happened centuries ago? A glance to my right revealed a smaller tunnel. The chanting definitely came from there. I forced myself to move closer. Each step seemed to match the beat of my racing heartbeat. The tunnel angled downward, the air colder with every inch. My breath came out in shaky puffs. Ahead, the walls reflected a faint, pulsing light. When I rounded a bend, I froze. Hunched over an altar-like rock formation was the silhouette of that same figure in a shawl, features partially obscured. It appeared to be tracing runes on the surface with one spindly finger, all while murmuring words I couldn't understand. Wave of pure dread swept over me. My knees felt weak, but I needed a photo, some tangible evidence. I raised my camera, pressing the shutter. The flash popped, momentarily illuminating the figure. In that stark light, I saw a face that was both ancient and inhuman, skin stretched taut, eyes black hollows, lips drawn back to reveal missing or broken teeth. A stench of decay hit me like a blow. Then the glow died and the figure spun with alarming speed, hissing like some feral creature. She lunged, arms outstretched. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my camera. My headlamp bobbed wildly as I scrambled to keep distance, the narrow passage stifling any chance to flee. She hissed again, her voice a ragged distortion, echoing with centuries of malice. My mind screamed that I was facing the spirit or manifestation of Agatha Fields, or something far worse. The moment her claw-like fingers grazed my jacket, a numbing, cold shot through me as though my very bones froze. Some desperate survival instinct fired. I let my camera slip around my neck, freeing a hand to yank the small flash from my belt pouch. I triggered it right in her face. Another blinding strobe. She shrieked, rearing back, as if the sudden light burned her. The chanting broke, and an unearthly wail filled the chamber, rattling the stone walls. I seized the chance to sprint away, adrenaline turning my legs into pistons. Behind me, that wail rose to a fever pitch, then abruptly cut off. Silence dropped like a hammer, broken only by my ragged breathing. Scrambling back through the corridors, I nearly fell multiple times. On slick rock, my camera battery died entirely, so my only light was the headlamp swinging across the stone. Every few seconds I risked a glance over my shoulder, terrified of the specter chasing me. But all I saw was emptiness. By the time I burst out into the forest, daylight stung my eyes and I collapsed at the base of a tree, sucking in breath after desperate breath. I don't recall how long I sat there trembling. Eventually, I mustered the will to get up, half crawling back to my RV, which I'd left at the small parking area. My watch told me it was just past noon, but it felt like midnight in my mind. My senses were scrambled, my thoughts a-tangled. Inside the RV, I locked every door and window, heart still hammering. The memory of that face, those eyes, would not leave me. When I finally calmed enough to check the camera's memory card, most of the cave shots were corrupted. Lines of static and greenish smears replaced the frames. But one image survived. Blurry and overexposed, it showed the shape of a woman in a shawl, arm raised, face a pale smear with deep hollows where eyes should have been. Terror roiled in my gut, but I also felt a grim satisfaction. It was something. I wanted to leave immediately, drive out of Hocking Hills and never look back. But my curiosity, maybe my stupidity, pushed me to take one last look at my campsite. When I arrived, I found the door scratched with runes again, deeper than before. I nearly gagged at the realization that bits of hair or thread were caught in the gouges, as if someone had pressed them there with ritualistic intent. That was enough for me. I powered up the RV's engine and left that clearing without a backward glance. I half expected the old woman to appear in the middle of the road, arms raised, forcing me to swerve. But the drive was strangely uneventful. The forest unspooled behind me in the rearview mirror. By late afternoon, I was back at the ranger station, practically collapsing into a chair in front of Carla Hicks. Her eyes widened at my disheveled state, and she listened silently as I explained what happened. When I showed her the single photo that wasn't corrupted, she didn't tell me I was crazy. She stared at the image for a long time, her face grave. "I'll have a team check that cave," she promised, though she didn't sound confident. But I've heard enough from locals over the years to believe something might be going on, might not be a person at all. I stayed just long enough to fill out a statement. Then I got in my RV and drove, heading north, away from Hocking Hills. The entire time I had the inexplicable sense of being watched. In the weeks since, I've looked over that photograph more times than I can count, searching for a mundane explanation. Lighting trick, double exposure, a patch of strange rock. None of those illusions fit. Something else is captured there, something that belongs in no rational worldview I know. I still make my living as a photographer, but I haven't returned to that part of Ohio. Sometimes I think about the runes scratched into my RV and wonder if they marked me. I caught a cold soon after, followed by unsettling nightmares where I wake up to find the old woman leaning over me, her eyes black and bottomless. After a few weeks, the nightmares mostly stopped, but I still feel a lingering presence. A certain hush in the quiet corners of night, a brushing sound like shawl fabric at the window. I can't say for sure if she's really gone. Whenever people ask about my time at Hocking Hills, I usually give them a sanitized version of the story, something about beautiful waterfalls and crisp autumn hikes. But if they press for details, if they seem genuinely curious, I might mention the local legends, how the area supposedly got its name. I'll hint at the possibility that some grudges never die, some curses never fade. And though I don't dare show the single surviving photo to just anyone, I keep it safe on my hard drive. Part of me wants to forget it, to pretend I never stood in that cave and heard chanting in the dark. Another part wants the world to know the truth, that there are places in the wilderness where nightmares slip free of folklore and wander among the living. I'm 37 years old, and for the way. First time in my life, I'm afraid of what lurks beyond the glow of my campfire. Because in Witch's Hollow, I saw something worse than a ghost story. I saw what happens when centuries-old hatred takes form and follows you home. I only hope that sharing this might keep others from following my footsteps too deep into those haunted woods. If you ever see that hunched figure beckoning from the trees, turn around. Whatever photo you might gain isn't worth your soul, and if you hear chanting echo through the rocks, run before the witch in the hollow claims you. 2. My name is Robert Rob Aldridge. I'm 45 years old, and I used to be a wildlife biologist before I decided to leave academia behind. I remember the day I packed up my small office, a handful of books on vertebrate anatomy, a jar, holding a snake skeleton, a couple of framed certificates, and a fading sense of passion. I'd spent nearly 20 years researching species population dynamics, writing scholarly articles, and attending conferences where no one ever seemed to agree on anything. Eventually, the excitement that once fueled me had flickered out. After I quit, I bought a used RV, figuring I could at least roam the country and try to find that spark of wonder I'd lost along the way. I began drifting from place to place, exploring national parks and lesser-known spots, always in search of something new, an undiscovered creature, a majestic piece of wilderness, or maybe just a hint of my old self. That's how I ended up at Salt Fork State Park in Ohio. I'd heard a rumor during my travels, sightings of a massive ape-like figure stalking the woods around the lake. Locals called it Bigfoot, the Ohio Grassman, or simply the Beast of Salt Fork. Normally, I'd roll my eyes at stories like that. There's no shortage of overblown cryptid tales in my line of work. But something about this rumor stirred my curiosity. Maybe I just missed the thrill of not knowing exactly what was out there. Salt Fork is a sprawling piece of land with thick forests, winding trails, and a large, placid lake that reflects the sky like a mirror at dusk. I arrived on a warm afternoon, just as the sun was dipping low over the trees. By chance, I ran into a park ranger named Denise Caldwell in the visitor parking lot. She looked to be in her late 30s, her brown hair pulled into a practical ponytail, wearing the standard green uniform. I asked about places to park my RV where I could have some solitude. She gave me a quick once-over and asked if I was here for the Bigfoot nonsense or if I was just a regular camper. Let's call it a bit of both, I said, trying to sound casual. I'm a retired wildlife biologist. I like to keep my ear out for local legends. Never know when you'll stumble onto a new species, right? She half laughed but seemed wary. Well, we get a lot of folks who come here hoping to see something. They rarely last more than a night out in the backwoods. If you're determined, there's a secluded area I can suggest. It's down an old gravel road that's not part of the main campground. No power, no picnic tables, basically just a clearing. Sound like what you want? I assured her it was perfect. She handed me a small map, jotted a circle on it, and warned, "Don't wander too far off the established trails. It's easy to get turned around. And watch out for real wildlife. Coyotes, bobcats, sometimes black bears. That's the bigger danger than any cryptid, if you ask me." I thanked her, hopped in my RV, and headed off. The drive took me past the main campground, through a canopy of oak and maple that glowed with late summer warmth. Eventually, the paved road gave way to gravel, and the trees closed in, as if corralling me deeper into their realm. A mile or so later, I found the clearing Ranger Caldwell had mentioned, a broad grassy patch surrounded by towering pines and thick brush. A picnic table would have been nice, but my RV was fully equipped, and solitude was my main goal. I parked, stretched my legs, and inhaled the scent of pine needles in the still air. Without the hum of highway traffic, I could hear the gentle buzz of insects. It was exactly the kind of quiet I'd hoped for. I spent the rest of that afternoon setting up a small perimeter, which basically involved checking for signs of recent wildlife activity. Tracks, scat, that sort of thing. I did spot a few deer prints near the edge of the clearing, but nothing unusual. The sun was sinking fast when I decided to drive back to the nearby gift shop I'd seen down by the main road. I'd heard that the guy who ran it was a cryptid enthusiast who sold plaster casts of oversized footprints. His name was Will Garrison. The shop was a modest wooden building, half tourist knickknacks and half self-styled Bigfoot museum. Large cardboard cutouts of an ape-like silhouette covered the exterior. Hard to miss. Inside, the air smelled like stale coffee and old books. Will, early 40s, tall, wearing a t-shirt with a snarling Bigfoot cartoon, greeted me with a wave. The place was cluttered with posters of alleged sightings, plaster footprints, and photographs of fuzzy shapes in the woods. I introduced myself, explaining that I was a retired wildlife biologist. He lit up like a child at Christmas, eager to show me his collection of cast footprints. "Check this out," he said, thrusting a plaster mold into my hands. "Look at the size. Almost 18 inches long and 7 inches wide. That's bigger than any human foot I've ever seen." He tapped a label scrawled in black Sharpie, Salt Fork, April 2023. I examined it. The shape was definitely humanoid, but with odd proportions. Long toes, a wide heel. "Where'd you find this?" "In the marshy area near the far side of the lake," Will replied. "Had a buddy out there fishing. Heard howls one night. Next morning found these prints in the mud." "Howls?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Like coyotes?" He shook his head vigorously. "I've heard coyotes all my life. This was different. Deeper, guttural. Freaked him out so bad he tore his line and left." I made non-committal sounds the way I often did when I wanted to stay polite but remain skeptical. Deep howls could come from a host of animals or even a particularly large dog. But something about Will's earnestness made me hold back from shooting him down outright. Besides, I was here partly because of these stories. Eventually, I left. The gift shop with a couple of local field guides. Will insisted I needed them, and a playful grin on my face. That night, I cooked a simple meal in my RV, set up my camp chair under the stars, and let the darkness wrap around me. The night sky was a velvet canopy of shimmering dots. I sipped a beer, listened to crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl, and felt truly content for the first time in months. Then at around midnight, I heard something. It started as a low moan, rising into a long, throaty howl that reverberated through the trees. I froze, beer halfway to my lips. The sound didn't match any coyote or fox calls I knew. It was too deep, too drawn out, more akin to a primate's whoop, but even that wasn't quite right. My skin prickled with goosebumps. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the tree line. The clearing was bathed in pale moonlight, every trunk and branch etched in silver. I listened for movement. A twig snap, a rustle of brush. Nothing but the echo of that haunting call. After a minute, silence reclaimed the forest. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks, fueled by the local legends. But I'd spent years cataloging animal calls, and this one didn't fit any I could recall. Deciding not to spook myself further, I retreated inside the RV and locked the door. Maybe the rumor had more substance than I'd thought. Took me a long time to doze off. In the morning, I set out with fresh eyes and a logical approach. As a biologist, I'd spent plenty of time tracking animals. If something big was wandering around here, it would leave signs. I hiked around the perimeter of the clearing, stepping carefully through dew-soaked grass. That's when I found them. Footprints in the mud near a small drainage area. They were enormous, larger than my size 12 boots, and distinctly human-like, with 5 apparent toes. Staring at them, I felt a mix of excitement and tension. Was someone playing a prank? But the depth of the prints indicated considerable weight, as if whoever made them weighed far more than a standard adult human. My heart pounded as I crouched, measuring the print with the small ruler I always kept in my day pack. About 16 inches long, 6 or 7 wide. My chest tightened. Either a local hoaxer had done a damn fine job or something with massive feet had passed by here. The logical part of me wanted to dismiss it, but the older part, the part that used to get a thrill from discovering a new salamander species or hearing an unrecorded bird call, quietly thrilled at the mystery. I followed the tracks as they led into the forest winding between oaks and maples. After 100 yards, they vanished on drier ground. I couldn't pick up a trail no matter how I searched. It was like the creature, or person, had bounded onto higher rocks or changed its gait to avoid leaving prints. Still, the footprints were enough to keep me on edge all day. Later, I tried setting up a motion-activated camera trap near that drainage, using the same gear I used to study wildlife migration. If anything big and bipedal came through again, I'd have photographic proof. Satisfied, I spent the rest of the afternoon collecting hair and scat samples around the area. Mostly deer, raccoon, coyote, nothing anomalous. That evening, I decided to take a drive toward the lake for a bit of fishing. I'm not much of an angler, but it was a relaxing way to pass the time. As I cast my line, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery oranges and soft pinks. Salt Fork's surface gleamed. I noticed a few fishermen near the dock discussing odd growls they'd heard while setting trot lines. I pretended, not to listen, but my ears perked up. When darkness fell, I returned to my campsite, grilled a quick dinner, and sat in my RV to review the day's camera trap footage. Halfway through scanning the memory card, the screen flickered. My laptop froze, the program crashing. Frustrated, I tried again. Same result. It was as if the files were corrupted. Irritated but still hopeful, I switched to a backup device. No luck. The footage from that trap was unusable, just static-laced partial frames. A chill ran down my spine. That equipment had never failed me before. Could be a technical glitch, I told myself. Or maybe the memory card was defective. Yet it felt oddly coincidental. I decided to check the camera itself. Stepping out with my flashlight, I marched to the drainage area. My camera was intact, but something had pawed or clawed at the casing, leaving scratch marks. No footprints this time. Maybe. The ground was too dry. My hand shook a bit as I rubbed the grooves in the plastic. Returning to my RV, I tried to settle. The night wore on, more silent than the previous evening. Around midnight, I suddenly heard heavy, measured steps in the brush behind my vehicle. Not the skittering of a small animal. These footsteps were slow, deliberate, carrying weight. I killed my interior lights, pressing my face to the window. Moonlight filtered through the canopy, but I couldn't see the source of the sound. Then, I smelled it, a pungent, musky odor like wet fur and rotten eggs. It wafted through my partially open window, making my stomach turn. I'd encountered some foul smells in the wild. Bear musk, decaying carcasses. But this was different. Sharp, invasive, almost chemical. The footsteps stopped. A few seconds. Later, I heard a low chuffing noise, almost like an irritated grunt. My heart hammered. Slowly, quietly, I unlatched the door and slipped outside, flashlight in hand. The odor grew stronger. I scanned the trees, half expecting to see a black bear. Instead, a large shadow shifted behind a trunk, maybe 30 feet away. My beam caught a pair of eyes reflecting back, then the shape ducked out of sight. A branch snapped, and with a burst of motion, it retreated deeper into the forest. Twigs crunched, leaves rustled, and then silence. The smell lingered in the air, though, making me cough. I stood there, adrenaline surging, for a long time before going back in. I could barely sleep. Images of some massive, unknown creature haunting my thoughts. When dawn arrived, I packed up my camera gear and marched straight to the ranger station. Ranger Caldwell recognized my anxious look. "You all right, Mr. Aldridge?" she asked. "Call me Rob," I said, voice uneasy. Something's messing with my cameras, leaving footprints. I can't shake the feeling there's a large, unknown animal out there. Or a very determined prankster. She frowned. "We've had occasional reports of big footprints and strange howls. I've even heard something weird a few times while on patrol at night. Could just be unusual wildlife behavior, but who knows? If you're feeling unsafe, you could move closer to the main campground." I shook my head. "I want to see this through, but maybe keep an ear out if I call for help." She gave me a half smile. "Fair enough. Just don't do anything reckless." On my way out, I passed Will Garrison strolling into the station, carrying some plaster casts. He beamed when he saw me. "Found more prints, Rob? Care to compare notes?" I hesitated, but some part of me craved a sounding board for my bizarre experiences. I ended up following him to his old pickup parked outside. He showed me a newer cast that looked eerily similar to the footprints I'd found, slightly smaller but with the same elongated shape. A date scrawled on it indicated he'd made it just a few days earlier. "This is from the western side of the park," he said. "A friend told me about hearing howls, so we investigated. They were fresh." I told him about the encounter the previous night, the corrupted camera files, and the stench. He nodded eagerly as though everything confirmed his convictions. "I've heard that odor described before, like a skunk, but worse. Feels odd to say this, but I'm starting to think there might be something out there," I admitted. still feeling a little silly. The footprints, the calls, the smell, they're consistent with, well, a large primate, maybe an undiscovered species. Will clapped me on the shoulder. You've got the science background, Rob. If you can prove it, you'll be famous. Fame wasn't what I wanted, though. My mind drifted back to the nights in the field, waiting patiently for hours just to glimpse a rare bird or a reclusive mammal. Part of me felt that old spark again. The other part wanted to pack up and run. That evening, I resolved to set a final trap. I placed multiple trail cameras around the perimeter of my campsite, each with new memory cards and fresh batteries. I spread them wide, ensuring coverage from multiple angles. If the creature came back, I'd catch it on at least one camera. I also baited a small area with a mixture of fruit scraps and leftover fish from my earlier attempt at fishing, hoping the smell might draw it closer. Sunset cast long shadows, turning the sky crimson and gold. I busied myself tidying the RV, mentally preparing for a vigil. The silence of the forest after dark felt heavier than usual, as though the trees themselves were bracing for something. I sat inside with my lights off, watching the monitors linked to my trail cams. The feed flickered in grayscale, showing nothing but swaying branches. Time crawled. Around midnight, the feed on one camera trembled. Then it cut out. My pulse spiked. A second later, another feed started to glitch. Without thinking, I grabbed my flashlight and eased outside, determined not to lose my evidence to corrupted files again. The air was tense, wind barely rustling, the leaves. Then I heard it. Heavy breathing, almost panting beyond my left-hand camera trap. My heart felt like it was about to leap out of my chest. Stepping around the RV, I aimed my flashlight, revealing a hulking figure at the edge of the clearing. It stood upright, easily 7 feet tall or more, covered in dark matted hair. Its shoulders were broad, arms long enough to hang near its knees. A sloping face turned toward me, eyes glinting with an eerie intelligence in the bright beam. My breath caught. This was no bear. No man in a costume could replicate that bulk, that fluidity of movement. For a split second, neither of us moved. Then the creature roared, a deep, resonant bellow that reverberated in my bones. The sheer volume forced me a step backward, heart pounding. It charged forward, crossing half the clearing in seconds. I stumbled, dropping to one knee, adrenaline screaming at me to run, but I remembered I had a flare in my jacket pocket, an emergency measure I'd used for scaring off bears in the past. Fumbling, I yanked it out, struck the cap, and unleashed a blaze of red fire. The sudden burst of light and noise made the beast skid to a stop. It shielded its eyes, or at least flinched, then turned sideways, letting out another growl that sounded pained or furious. I used that moment to scramble back, half crawling. The creature cast a massive silhouette in the flickering glow, each breath rattling like a snarl. Then with a final roar, it pivoted and crashed into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. The flare hissed, sparks dying on the grass. For a moment, all I could do was breathe, shaking so badly I nearly dropped the flare entirely. Once the creature's footsteps faded, I dared to rush to my cameras. The first I found was smashed, lens shattered, memory card missing. The second was lying in the dirt, battered but maybe salvageable. My chest felt tight, torn between awe and terror. I'd come face to face with a living legend, a massive ape-like being. But I had no idea if my cameras caught anything conclusive before it destroyed them. It was dawn by the time I worked up the nerve to review the camera that wasn't utterly destroyed. My hands trembled as I slid the memory card into a backup reader. The screen flickered through a few glitchy frames. Then I saw it. A single grainy still capturing the side profile of a gigantic, upright figure stepping into the clearing. The angle wasn't great, but the outline was unmistakable. Large head, broad torso, long arms. My breath caught in my throat. For a moment I felt a swell of exhilaration. Evidence. Then reality set in. If I shared this publicly, would anyone believe it? Would it spark a wave of thrill seekers flooding the park, harming both the creature and the natural habitat? The The scientist in me said, yes, you shared data to let the facts speak. But a different voice cautioned that exposing it might do more harm than good. The memory of that roar, so full of living power, hung in my mind. I spent the next few hours packing my gear. There was no way I could stay here, not after a direct confrontation like that. The knowledge that such a being roamed these woods sent a shiver through me. If it was real, it deserved space, caution, maybe even protection. I wanted no part in turning it into a media circus. And I'll admit, I was afraid. That deep bellow haunted my ears. Before I left, I stopped by the ranger station one last time. Denise Caldwell was outside talking to a pair of uniformed officers. When she saw the look on my face, she dismissed them and took me aside. "You all right?" she asked. I told her everything. The chase, the smashed cameras, the one blurred, but telling photo. Her expression became grim. "I've never seen it myself, but I believe you, Rob. We get strange calls sometimes. Campers going missing for a few hours, hearing roars that we can't explain." I nodded, pulling the memory card from my pocket. "I have a grainy image. Not sure if it's proof enough for the world, but it's enough for me. I think I'm done here." She reached out, gently curling my fingers back over the card. "I won't ask for it unless you want to share. But you should know. If there's something out there, I'd like to keep it safe from harm too. Let me know if you ever need anything." I thanked her. In that moment, I sensed that she understood the weight of discovering something extraordinary, of choosing how to handle it. I left the station, feeling a mix of relief and sorrow. A piece of me longed to stay, to study the creature, observe it from a distance, prove it scientifically. But another part knew some mysteries might be best left in the shadows. I guided my RV onto the highway, watching Salt Fork's lush forests fade in my mirrors. My mind replayed the confrontation again and again. The massive shape, the roar, the fear and awe intertwined. I felt changed, as though I'd brushed against a living piece of legend. Was it truly a species undiscovered by science? An offshoot of a known primate, or something else entirely? Even now, I'm not sure what I experienced can be rationalized. I've spent my life analyzing data and labeling phenomena. But the beast of Salt Fork didn't fit neatly into a chart or a research paper. It was raw, primal, and utterly alive, in a way that defied my training. In the days since, I've looked at that single grainy image dozens of times. I've come close to sharing it online or with the cryptid enthusiasts I've met, but each time I hesitate. I'm Robert Aldridge, 45, a man who thought he'd seen it all in the wild. I learned differently on that night in Ohio. The wilderness can still hold secrets beyond our comfortable logic. Some secrets might even have the power to remind us how small we are in the grand design, that not everything needs our classification or explanation. At least that's what I tell myself when I'm parked at a new campsite, lying awake in my RV with the memory of those eyes, that roar echoing in my head. Because once you've heard a legend's heartbeat, the dark edges of the forest never feel quite the same. And no matter how far I travel, I'll always wonder what's lurking, out there just beyond the glow of my campfire, in places where science hasn't yet pried open every secret.